Can you still see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Yes.
Great.
All right, I'm gonna hit start broadcast.
Go for it. Welcome, everyone. We're just going to give everybody a chance to get from the waiting room into the webinar. We had about 150 people registered. Okay, about 10 or so more seconds. People are still coming in. Again, welcome everybody. We're just letting folks make their way from the waiting room into the webinar. Okay. It is 3 p.m., so I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Returning Employees to the Workplace Amid COVID-19 Challenges, brought to you by Domain Computer Services. I'm Kate Conroy, Vice President of Strategic Partnerships for the New Jersey Business and Industry Association. With us today is Warren Cook of Symbiance Hire. A few housekeeping matters before we get started. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be emailed to you tomorrow along with the PowerPoint for today's presentation, so be on the lookout for those. If you just can't wait, you can download them right now from the Handouts tab. But I'd also like to draw your attention to the Questions tab. Warren would be happy to take your questions, so get them in as they come to you. One last thing, it's definitely been getting better, but we've still been noticing people having audio-visual issues with GoToWebinar as they struggle to keep up with all the extra video conferencing going on right now. If you have any trouble viewing or hearing during this presentation, don't forget you will automatically be receiving a recording within 24 hours. So you have to sign out and watch the recording, you won't miss a thing. So now, without further ado, Warren, take us away.
Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to this. Let's share my screen here. Okay. Kate, screen is visible for everybody?
Yes, indeed. It looks great.
Fantastic. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your busy day to spend this hour with us. Talking about your workforce, your businesses, and getting back to a norm. So I'm pleased to be here this afternoon and talking to you about COVID-19 and returning to the workplace. Today, there's about 6 items that I'm going to try to cover during this presentation to you. And as Kate mentioned, we want to make sure that if you do have questions that come to mind while we're going through this presentation, please send them through and we'll do our best in the last quarter of the hour to get those questions answered, or if not, we'll get those questions answered via email or some other format back to you. So today we're going to cover workplace cornerstones, a topic that we really review the fundamentals related to your workplace and things going on in the workplace and what really makes up that workplace. We're going to talk about your current state of your business, as well as designing a future state for your business as we go through this situation, as we go through this crisis, but also its strategies and practices that really help you not only now, but as well in the future or any time in your business history. We're going to talk and focus on returning those employees to the physical work site. In some cases, it may be getting people back into an office, and in some cases, it may not be getting back in the office, but having some different or change in how their work is performed. Which brings us to developing kind of that new normal. It's a huge hot buzzword out there. Everybody's talking about it. Everybody's using it. But we certainly aren't going to be back to the state we were before this crisis hit. And so while it might not be a new normal, it may be a new way of operating and doing things. We're going to take some time to review your policies and practices that require attention specifically and especially during this time period. But it's a good thing to look at and review at any time when you're facing changes, both internal, external changes that may impact your business. And then finally, we're going to talk about strategies and immediate application. I always have a goal through webinars and training presentations to do as much transition of information so that you can take this knowledge back to the workplace today and tomorrow and immediately begin making changes that affect and help you with sustaining success going forward. So today, my goal, and what you'll find is a lot of these slides have a few bullets on them that I'm going to talk to, and I'm not going to be reading necessarily all the slides to you. And in other cases, I did have some details on the slides and in the slide deck so that if you're referencing this document and if you're not taking notes or if you just want to have a good guide later, you can just read line by line and understand kind of what we talked about today. But my goal is always to provide practical knowledge and transfer my knowledge and experience to you so that you can apply and use these perspectives and use this information in a way that fits and can be customized to your workplace and your organization. I want to give you the guidance and advice on how you develop and execute a strategic plan to return your workforce to the physical offices and all the various things and steps you need to take and be considering during this time to get you there and to make sure that you have things in place. And then I want to really offer you a different perspective on how you approach your business, how you approach your practices that will lead you to developing an organizational process and practices and culture that lead to success, especially during these challenging times. But really, these are strategies and skill sets you can apply to your business as a leadership team or ownership or a manager that will help you ongoing. So we're going to dive right into it. And throughout this presentation, I have 4 questions I'm going to ask the audience to participate in. And Kate, if you could share out that first question and launch it. I really want to understand, just if you could help me understand your role in your organization. So are you an owner or C-suite? Are you part of the HR team? Are you a functional leader or manager? Are you a manager or supervisor of people? Maybe not the functional leader or maybe some other role, but this will kind of just help me get an idea of who the audience is and make sure I can cover all the aspects of these roles as we're going. So we'll leave that go for about 20, 30 seconds. So you have a chance to go ahead and click on it, and then we'll collect the results, we'll share them, and then we'll move on with the next topic. But it's key to understand that all these various roles and all these functions in the organization really need to come together, really need to collaborate, and you need to identify who the stakeholders are in your organization so that you can work well together in developing these strategies and these plans that will, go on beyond just this crisis, but ride this wave throughout. So give it another 10 or 15 seconds, and then Kate will close the poll. And we're looking forward to kind of jumping right into the next stage of our conversation today, which really is the fundamentals around your workplace cornerstones. So Kate, do you want to close that and then share the results? And we'll take a quick look at that and see what we have today.
So I just shared the results. Are you able to see them?
No.
Okay, 24% is an owner, 37% is human resources, 3% is a functional leader, 27% is a manager supervisor, and 16% is another role. And I will chat those to you as well.
Fantastic, thank you. So thank you everybody for contributing to that. It's very helpful. So it looks like a lot of people leaders are on the call and a lot of HR staff too that are probably charged with handling a lot of these practices. So I'm glad, so welcome, and I'm glad you're here today. So let's talk about workplace cornerstones, and from my perspective, these are really critical, and these are really the concepts and constructs of your business that are going to help you through this process. So cornerstones, it's really about how does an employee, how does a client, how does a customer, how are you viewed, right? When you think about how an organization that you work for or part of is viewed, what is that? What are they thinking about? How are you being viewed? And these views and perspectives are really a representative of your culture, of how you operate internally, what your social and community responsibility is, how the world around your business views you, and it includes your branding. So whether you're an organization that's all brick and mortar and it's your office space or your storefront, whether you're an online organization or business, however you've been interacting and connecting with your suppliers, your vendors, your customers, all of that comes down to representative of how they view your company, and it's tied to some cornerstone constructs about your business. And what I really want to key in on is how you handle COVID and the crisis we're facing now is going to positively impact or potentially negatively impact how your business is viewed by everyone. And so it's really key to think about word of mouth, how things are getting out, communication, social media, the ease of communication. What you do now is either going to highlight you as an employer of choice who really took care of things well, or it's going to highlight you having some exposures and gaps that you might need to fix. So keep that in mind when we're going through this, and when you're thinking about those strategies and how to implement new practices. It's, you are being viewed by the outside world a lot of different ways, and that outside world can be crafted in a way that's dependent on these cornerstones. So when I think about company culture, there's sometimes a huge disconnect between what the leadership team or the owners of an organization believe the culture to be and what's actually going on in the culture in the workplace. And I've been in situations where I've asked the leadership team to define their culture. You go and talk to someone at the front desk or a frontline worker, and it's a very different view. So this is very critical to think about, especially during a time when you're about to bring a workforce back into the workplace or into physical locations and connect them, that the actions and behavioral norms of the people in the workplace are your culture. Doesn't matter how you document, define it, communicate it. What's really happening is that culture. And why I find this is a cornerstone and critical component of this whole strategy to get back to work is this is going to evolve. Your culture is going to evolve as your workforce changes, as your practices and processes changes. But your core values as a company come out and come through based on the actions, behaviors of your leadership and your managers who are promulgating this culture in the workplace. And so culture, how you do your work, how you communicate, how you engage one another, how you communicate with one another, how you share your goals of this process are really going to help define what your culture is and what your culture has been, and whether or not the culture you've wanted all this time has been as successful as you hoped it would be. Communication is another cornerstone. And over the years and last 2 decades, whenever I've helped organizations conduct employee surveys and gather that information to find out what the organization really thinks, communication is almost one of the problem areas each and every time. It's usually compensation, communication, and growth, right? There's some core things that we talk about. But it's a big problem that you want to identify and address, especially if it's been a problem historically, because transparency is going to be critical during this crisis. And getting communication out where it's clearly understood, effectively understood, and really helps demonstrate to the workforce that you care about them and that you care about their safety as they come back is going to be key. So when you think about 3 pillars, this communication and this culture that come together with the next thing we're going to talk about, which is engagement, it's very important to really reflect honestly on how effective has communication been in the past and what challenges have you experienced in communication, both upward and downward, that may inhibit or create a new challenge that you don't need right now as you're working through this. And then, however your culture and your communication existed before, even though we've had maybe an enhancement of communication or a different medium of communication through chat rooms and Zoom videos and all the other things we're doing, the culture you established in communication in the past may not have been what you need today to make sure you're creating that trust during and ongoing in this exchange. You're going to really want to focus on how do you ensure that your workforce, your employees, trust what leadership is doing and trust that the communication and the information is done in a way that is for protecting their safety, their wellness, and those things will result in your business being successful as you move through and getting back to this new way of working. Now, when I think about the 3rd pillar, which is, to me, engagement, engagement is about the employer and employee relationship and how effective communication is and how effective you work with employees to share ideas. And there's a way to think about it holistically across your organization, in which overall, would the majority of employees say that management listens, we can share ideas, but also down to supervisor-employee relationship, from when goals are being set, from when expectations are being communicated, from when performance is being evaluated. All of those communication points and all those triggers really come together to talk about how engaged your workforce is. And the reason I bring this up as a pillar is that if your leadership had solid and positive engagement pre-COVID, and if you continue those behaviors and you can instill those behaviors on others, it's going to make the implementation of these new processes and new programs much more successful, because engagement leads to trust and engagement leads to a much more critically impacting production and performance. So great engagement leads to good communication, which leads to really well performed employees and the ability to learn and grow. And then trust and confidence in leadership is critical, because if your workforce today hears a message about when you're returning to the office or when you're coming back to the workplace or what they have to do when they get back or as they're coming back, and they don't trust that you're doing what's in their best interest, not just the best interest of the business or revenue, you may lose people. You may have people not follow those processes. You may have people drop off and not be contributing to it. And it can backfire very quickly if the workforce isn't willing to help you navigate these challenges that we're facing. So I'm going to ask another question, and considering the cornerstones that I just covered and presented, how would you describe your current workplace cornerstones? Are your cornerstones strong? And thank you for shooting that poll out, Kate. Are they strong? Do you feel that they're adequate right now? When you evaluate it in the context that we're talking about, do you think your workforce cornerstones are weak? Or are you just not sure because maybe you have a perspective, but other functions in the organization might have a different view? And when you think about this, it doesn't mean if they're weak or not adequate right now. That doesn't mean that you have tremendous problems. It just means you're going to be able to identify what to work on and the sequencing of what to work on as we develop a strategy to get those employees back in the workforce. So in that context, your cornerstone, strong, adequate, weak, or you're not sure. And we'll give it another 10 or 15 seconds here, and then I will ask for the results, and we can continue on with the conversation and what we're talking about. It is key that we think about where we're at today over and over and evaluating our current state, and I mean our current state of the workforce, our current state of our organization operation, because it's going to really allow us to design a really good and successful path forward. So we'll talk about that in a second. Kate, how do the results look from the poll we just shared?
66% voted. I'm going to close it right now, and I'm going to share the results.
Fantastic.
31% strong, 44% weak, 31% strong, 44% adequate, 11% weak, 13% uncertain, and I will chat those to you right now.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I'm pleased to hear that some organizations are feeling that their efforts in building a really solid culture, engagement, communication are good, because those strengths are going to help you through this process. If you feel they're adequate, which means maybe there's some room for improvement, or they're weak at this point, definitely as we go through these next slides and the rest of this presentation, you're going to want to focus on how you can address your culture, your communication engagement to help you with this. So I want to share this visual with you, and this is how I view from an organizational perspective and a path forward where we're at. Before COVID, you had your culture in place, you had your communication style in place and wherever you're at, and some level of engagement. And then we get hit with COVID-19 and everyone's world is turned over. Every business has some sort of impact, employees, people, and change happens. Whether it's a lockdown, shutdown, whether you were essential or not essential, whether you had a problem determining those things. But current state now, and now is today, you have some limited amount of work, or maybe more than limited, but a limited amount of work being done remotely. You might have unclear expectations with your organization, whether how are we going to move forward, whether it's about compensation, time off, what if I get sick, how do I report it? Maybe supervisors who were not as skilled as we would have liked them to have been, or newer supervisors might not know how to set expectations. I've had a lot of organizations share with me that they struggle with performance management during this time because expectations went all over the place. And then you have technology challenges. We all went to a virtual world, even if we were using it before. As much as we thought we were there, we ran into all kinds of challenges in how we actually get work done. And then communication breakdown could have happened for sure. Whether it is a technology flaw or whether it was just a matter of frequency and duration and point of contact, the workforce may have lost connection with their people leaders or managers. So we have this current state, and over on the right, this new normal that we're trying to get to is where we want to be. And so, we have to develop new work processes. We have to be able to set very clear expectations going forward. we may have to change technology or utilize technology in a new and different way just so our employees can be successful. New methods of communication, email might be great, Zoom videos may be great, but you might have to augment that. You might have to augment that with other types of team communications. You might have to augment that with some kind of status reporting or more frequent meetings between supervisors and employees or team collaboration. And then finally, what's not really in the current state is you have to find a way to hold people accountable in this new world we live in. They have to find a way to make sure that they're performing their duties and responsibilities effectively so that you can sustain your business. Too often, through this change management process and through this communication process, we don't do as an effective a job as we would like in making sure accountability exists, and not just holding people accountable for doing something wrong, but helping them be accountable to the business to do it right so that they can support the ongoing sustainable success of the business. And throughout, there's this change management that we want to be cognizant of. And then finally, I think for all of us, maintaining a safe workplace becomes really critical and really important. That overrides each and every decision we're making when we sit down and as leadership team or as managers or even as employees deciding to come back. The question is, am I going to be safe? Am I able to go back in the workplace safe? When you think more specifically, and my advice and guidance on this is when you're doing this current state analysis, really take a look at all of your policies, procedures, and practices. And when I say all, I mean, I really do mean take a look at your HR policies, take a look at your work processes, take a look at the practices that have worked and not worked, and really think about, are there things you can do differently, and are you involving all the right people in making those decisions? Are you changing something in your operations that might impact your finance team in APAR? Are you doing something with the production or communication of something, but the contracts group isn't available to provide the documentation? So really be very thoughtful about who's involved in doing this analysis and figuring out, everybody's contribution, which will create engagement through the process. And then as you're looking at things, you may find that everything you're doing may not be consistent. Not necessarily unfair, but it might not be consistent across the organization because different people are at different levels. In one company I had been interacting with, they had certain positions that were doing more than other people in the same role simply because of internet activity, or they were able to get them laptops and they weren't able to get the other group laptops. And so make sure, however you're executing this process, you're being consistent in how you do it, and you're taking into account the various roles and positions people hold, and also the roles they're supposed to be performing. And then accountability. In this frame of mind, in this perspective, is there accountability for how things are getting done now? Can take a look at who is accountable for what, because now that everybody's remote and not in the workplace, you want to make sure that that process is working, and that as you bring people back, that you may have to redefine who's responsible for what and where authority sits within the organization. When you think about now your future state, and the future state may be returning people to the physical workplace, it may be a hybrid of physical people in the workplace and home. It could be altered schedules. It could be alternate weeks. It could be a lot of different things. But whatever it's going to be, you really want to be able to define how will the work be performed. And one of the things that I like to think about in this scenario, which is something I bring through when I'm talking about staff meetings and new supervisors, is this effort of looking at where you want to be future state compared to where you are today is really a start, stop, continue type of exercise. Because when you're looking at all the external factors, the policies, the regulations, the guidelines, the safety protocols, the CDC, whatever it may be, one of the things you want to think about is, are there things we were doing before COVID that we just need to stop doing? They didn't make sense, they didn't add value, they didn't create the right cornerstone, the right culture, whatever it may be, but there might be things you need to stop doing. And then there's going to be things that you identify that you need to just continue doing. They work well, they've worked through the COVID crisis, they've worked when they're in a remote workplace, whether it's a communication path, whether it's a process, whatever it may be, you want to identify what those are and reinforce those to make sure that they are being worked on consistently because they're effective for your business. And then the third part of that is the start. I think the biggest emphasis is going to be during this regrouping and starting over in the work site is, what do you need to start doing that did not exist before? Keep in mind, from a very practical perspective, especially since the majority of the folks on the call are people leaders, is that if you were struggling with accountability, or you were struggling with process and procedure compliance in the past, if you were struggling with people doing what they're supposed to do anyway, and you didn't have people leaders who could hold them accountable due to lack of competence, training, experience, whatever it may be, starting new practices now going forward is going to be a challenge. It's going to be more difficult than ever before because we're all starting this together and we're all learning it at the same time. So rather than saying, hey, you have a new work policy or practice where instead of going to this department, you go to this department first and you reroute something differently, that might be easy to do. But in this situation, the way you want the work performed might be completely new for everyone. So going into that, you want to make sure that, as the last bullet points out, that every new process and procedure is not written in stone and it's robust and flexible so that it's sustainable and can actually adapt as you get back into the workforce, especially if you create some phased approach in coming back in the workplace. The red highlighted item on this slide around future state preparation is compliance. And really, compliance in this day and age is really about risk management. And so focus heavily, especially the HR leaders on this call, focus on your employment practices that are going to lead to risk and liability. That second bullet there about your employees could be your greatest risk. Historically, pre-COVID, I always told business leaders that your employees and your supervisors who don't follow the rules are always your greatest risk. There's always external factors, but those employees can be your risk. I think now more than ever before, after the COVID crisis is being mitigated and we're moving through it, employees are going to start wanting to find ways to hold someone accountable for whatever they felt happened to them negatively. Whether that's they weren't communicated right, whether they weren't provided the leave they were supposed to, whether they didn't have the time off, whether they weren't paid for something properly, whether they want to blame your business for getting sick. All those things are extra risk and liabilities for your business. And so when you're preparing your future state of how you're going to operate and how you're going to engage and how you're going to communicate in this new culture you develop, you want to be cognizant of the fact that if you don't do a good job of building that trust and relationship, your employees could actually be a huge source of problem for your business. So let's take a moment here and talk about, now we want to return these employees to work. And how do we do it safely, right? We want to do it in a safe manner. We want to make sure that it's effective and so forth. So, you should have some goals established when you're going to return people to the physical office. And you want to make sure that there's an understanding that safety is key, the well-being of your employees, your greatest asset, right? Your human capital. So what are you doing and how are you being transparent about the safety of the workplace when they come back to their role? But after that, you want to kind of look at what is truly important for the business and what's essential. And I don't mean all the different jurisdictions around the state and the country that say these are essential roles, these are not, because ultimately we could probably navigate and find some way to make some part of our workforce essential in the community. But what I mean is your business processes themselves. What steps have you done historically that you do and you're not even sure why you do it, and they might not even be necessary? And how do you identify those really critical pieces of the process that you need to emphasize, highlight, and make sure gets done well? And so what I'm talking about when you're thinking about this return to the physical office is taking a few steps back and figuring out how can you establish operational excellence, right? How can you make those process improvements now that make your business as effective or even more effective than before because you've had time to evaluate it? One of the things from a performance perspective that a lot of businesses may have learned, and to the normal business community, employee community, I would say, it's shocking to think, but a lot of business owners realize that they had too many people, or they had people in the wrong roles, or they didn't have the right roles filled, or there was a much better way to do something and they've just always done it that way because they've always done it that way. This is a great time and opportunity to look at those operational effectiveness, look at your operational excellence, and come up with a way to ensure that how the work gets done is extremely practical, but also productive. We want to get you back working successfully. We want to get employees back aiding and contributing to that success. And that success is going to be there by creating practical ways to do their work and practical ways to do their job. One of the other things that I will say is that you want to think about having a phased approach if you can, so phase those actions and activities in. Quick review of regulatory obligations just as an awareness. So make sure you understand all the federal, state, and local laws. Make sure you're thinking about the guidelines that exist. make sure you're thinking about your responsibilities as an employer, know what you need to do, and also know what you don't need to do. Far too often, employees come to the workplace saying, you need to do this, you need to do that, not knowing whether or not the employer actually meets the obligations of that law or regulation. So become familiar with that. Understand the employees' rights, such as the FFCRA that came out, which is in effect this year and has various leave rights and paid leave rights that impact your business. And you may want to brush up on your understanding of the ADA laws and accommodation requests. You may want to make sure if your company's over 50 that you are understanding FMLA obligations and how that might work together. Workers' compensation practices and reporting, as well as any short-term disability programs and policies you have in place, or any that are required by state law. Really make sure you understand this, because these things are going to be triggered by employees coming back into the workplace. On the PPEs, which is personal protective equipment, we really want to make sure that you do your best to follow the CDC guidelines for safe working conditions. But two things I highly recommend. One is, from day one of when you start interacting with your workforce and thinking about what they need and what you want them to do, keep good documentation. Keep really solid COVID-19 records of your actions, your communications, what you did, because it's better to have the extra documentation and never need it to defend your actions versus getting sued or having something bad happen in the future and not being able to show your good intentions and everything you did as a business for your workforce and for the organization. When thinking about bringing people back to the workplace, PPE shouldn't be the same for everybody. There should be a minimum PPE requirement for everyone in the workplace, and then beyond for other employees who have specific duties or responsibilities that might have public interaction, that might have interaction with some other aspects of the business. They might have more contact with people. They might be traveling. So whatever else is there, go back and look at those job descriptions, look at those roles and responsibilities, and from there, take it to the next level and making sure that they have what they need for PPE. Now, employees coming back, and I'm sure you're already experiencing this on a daily basis, they're going to have a lot of questions. Even if you outline an FAQ, they're going to have a million questions for you to answer. One thing I recommend and strongly recommend is train your people leaders. Make sure all of your people leaders are on the same page. Give them refresher training on your existing policies and procedures around benefits or leave programs, and then really have a focused, concerted effort in training your people leaders on the policies you implement for COVID, so that you have one voice. You do not want to run into situations where you have 8 voices out there giving different pieces of information to your workforce and then having inconsistent practices or potentially discriminatory practices across the workplace by treating people differently completely unintentionally. So spend time preparing your people leaders to answer questions, arm them with information, arm them with FAQs, guideline documents, handouts, worksheets, whatever it may be. Create on your intranet an area to access this information, but really make sure you have everybody educated and informed on how to answer employee questions. We're going to do a quick poll for the third piece here as to whether or not you and your organization have created a communication plan to roll out what you're going to be doing and how you're going to be making these changes for the workplace. So really the question is, have you developed a strategic communication plan? I'm not even worried about the content yet, but you have a plan of how you're going to get the information out to the workforce, and then when and how often you're going to communicate. And I'm curious if you've done this, because we've all been communicating ongoing, but if we're now really sitting down and saying, okay, on this date and time, we plan on opening our doors back up, there's a lot backtracking you have to do in order to prepare for that. And if you do not have a strategic plan, it's something we want to consider, and we're going to talk a little bit about what needs to be in that plan in a moment. So Kate, if you want to go ahead and close that poll, and we'll see how everybody on the call here responded to that, that'd be great.
Yep, we had 49% of people vote, 68% yes, 27% said no, and 5% said I am not sure.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you, Kate. So I'm very pleased again to hear that everyone is thinking about it in some way, shape, or form, but that's a large percentage of you have actually put some plan in place. So the information that follows may help you tweak and customize those plans. For those who do not have a strategic plan in place, this is going to give you a lot of things to think about as you work towards bringing people back in the workplace. So this new normal, what's it mean for you? What's it mean for your workforce? So your leadership team is going to set the tone. And we can't flip a switch, right? We can't just say, hey, everybody, we're back to what was before, because if nothing changed in your workplace, in your perspective, there is one major component that's changed, and that's all your people. People have been impacted in traumatic ways in some cases. They may have lost loved ones. They may be facing with illness or sickness. They may have faced layoffs and downsizing or furloughs or whatever it may be, unemployment challenge, whatever it is, they face something. And so your workforce, regardless, is different today. And so you want to make sure that you demonstrate all the appropriate actions and behavior so that you can promote to your workforce that you understand they went through and are going through trauma, that they're going through risks and there are dangers in what's happening, and that you are doing everything in your power. And this is where that communication, engagement, and trust comes in, that you're communicating that you're doing everything in your power to address their fears, which in their views are real fears for them. And so as you try to return people to the workplace, make sure you're recognizing in your communication strategy and all your materials that you put out there that you recognize it's not easy for them to do, and that them contributing to your business and coming back and helping you be successful is valuable to you and that you appreciate it. Make sure that leadership is accessible, make sure you're communicating often, and help them understand that this new normal may keep changing, but it is specific for your organization. So what one company is doing in an organization is not going to be the same for every other organization. And that's why on this slide, what I talk about here is being flexible. If you're creating a strategic plan to return people to the office and you've locked it down and you've put it in place, by next week, I guarantee you something's going to influence that process and something's going to impact that communication where you're going to have to adjust. And so what's really key throughout this is being flexible, being robust, and letting the employees know that things may go up and down, back and forth, but you really want to have a path forward that gets you there eventually. And that we may have setbacks, we may have other problems, but you as an employer are going to do what you can to ensure there's a line of communication that's effective. You're going to do what you can to make sure that you communicate well and that everyone can contribute to providing the services and products of the business. For the people leaders on this call and the management team, effective change management is critical. It's really critical to make sure that you have change management practices in place. Can you launch, Kate, the last poll question?
Yep.
When you think about change management and when you think about the organization, what I'd like to know is the last question, and then we're going to get through the last few slides and get to questions for you, is have you completed policy reviews, and which will help you determine what changes are necessary and what changes are important for you to get that sustainable success and to achieve what you want to going forward. And the last part of this presentation before we get into Q&A is really going to touch on what those policies and practices are that you need to look at, what you need to evaluate, what you need to be communicating, and how you want to go about doing those communications and doing that information. So I do appreciate everyone contributing to these polls. I know our goal isn't to make you work on this, it's really to educate you and give you guidance and information. But thank you so much for participating and helping us with the information. It really helps me out. So Kate, let's close that poll and see what the results are, and then we will jump into the last few slides of conversation.
Great. We are at 57% of people voted, 60% said yes, 32% said no, and 8% said I am not sure. Okay,
fantastic. Again, congrats to the audience for a really large portion of the audience taking steps to have policy reviews and practice reviews. So what we want to talk about with this review, and those who haven't, don't feel bad that you haven't. If you aren't going back to the workplace yet, you may not have even considered doing any of this because it's not time in your mind yet. But as you go down this path, here's what's critical. You want to make sure that you have something in place that's going to allow employees to communicate to you when they have a positive test result, when they feel they've had exposure, when they feel they've been immunocompromised, if they have safety concerns. So this type of policy may not have existed before. In fact, it probably didn't exist before. And so you want to specifically outline in the new COVID-19 return to work policy or whatever you call it, this information. Beyond that, which is probably a creation of policy, you want to talk about your leave and return to work policies. Review them and make sure that whatever new laws, regulations, obligations, and guidelines have been implemented that you've made those adjustments, made those changes, and not only made the changes, but communicated out to the workforce and are offering some sort of training if you're updating a handbook or if you're doing an addendum that's going to cover a lot of this. Your vacation, your sick, your paid time off policies, all those are really important right now because people are going to be saying, I want to take off. Was that my PTO time? Was that my sick time? Do I still have time? Wait a minute, if I use the FCCRA, does that count towards my vacation? And if you were unable to get ahead of this communication, when you build this communication strategy and you roll it out, these are topics you want to make sure you cover. Workplace injury and illness reporting. Make sure your people leaders are well trained and your policy covers obligations around reporting, because we want someone who is sick, feeling sick, is exposed to sickness or illness, is reporting that and tracking that and taking care of knowing who's there and protecting the workforce, whether it's getting them out of the workforce, putting them on quarantine, sending them back home, or making sure that some steps are taken to notify HR so that other benefits or policies can be triggered and move forward. Really think about your FLSA classification and compensation practices. When you have a policy, when you have a workforce that's remote, and if you're not tracking time worked, if you're not tracking hours, word will get out eventually to some of your workforce that says, oh my God, wait a minute, were you working overtime? Did they pay you overtime? And during this crisis, one of the things we don't want any of you facing is an FLSA lawsuit about bad compensation practices or failure to pay or failure to record information. So this is one that you really should review, take a look at how you're handling this and are you complying with those non-exempt employees out in your workforce. You may want to do a job description review. If you don't have job descriptions, I strongly urge you get them, build them, design them. But if you have them, take a look, because compensation and the duties and responsibilities of your employees may need to change since what they're doing is very different. I'll give you a very quick example. I have an organization I work with that has people that travel out in the field. They do project consulting work as well as BD work. And right now they weren't doing any travel for the last 3 months. So a large portion of their job changed and stopped, which also drove a change in the job description and a change in the compensation because they were no longer actually able to do some of the work. So it may be very important to do a review in practice of how the job's getting done. And then make sure if you have an open door policy or you have open door complaint reporting procedures that you encourage them and remind employees to use it, because you want to keep any problems or challenges within the organization before they potentially go outside the organization and litigate it or try to litigate it. This quick slide is more for reference later about change management. We spoke about it, but these are the components that you want to make sure as you're going through these critical changes for your business. Make sure that you can keep up with your training, your communication, that you're transparent in how you speak about these issues. And then remember that change is constant. So whatever happens today, tomorrow, the next day, there's no one single COVID event. COVID is here for the long haul, hopefully not too long. But right now, while it's here, we're going to have to keep adapting and make changes ongoing. So the better you and your team can get it, how do you manage change? How do you make decisions? How do you communicate the results of those decisions? That change management is going to be critical. And the last bullet here is really help your workforce understand the changes you're making. Okay, be collaborative. It's not an evolution. It's an evolution. It's not an overnight revolution, right? So these things are going to happen slowly. You're not going to flip the switch today and tomorrow people are in trouble for not following something that you're just trying to implement in the workforce. And now the last piece here that I'm going to go through, and again, you'll have these slides to reference, but practical strategies and how do you use this information that I shared with you today in these slides and things that this has you thinking about, how do you get to it right away? So identify and look at all the functional stakeholders in your business and discuss where you're headed and what you're trying to do together so that you can create new policies around COVID and look at the practices you have in place. Make sure you're holding your people leaders accountable for consistency, right? Consistent communication, consistent application of policy, consistent enforcement. Don't play favorites. Really make sure that everyone is on the same page. I strongly urge you to create, if you haven't already, an FAQ for your workforce on how to interact with you, how to interact with supervisors and managers, and then create maybe a task force, a team, whatever terminology you'd like to use, but get a cross-functional group of people together and include HR if you have it, which will give credence to the ability for employees to reach out and have confidential conversations around what they're dealing with. You don't want every supervisor and every manager being told what their illness is, their sickness, their family situation. HR's profession is really designed to hold those confidential conversations, to put the employee at ease and help support the business from a compliance manner, but also risk management. Set your expectations and be clear with the workforce. Make sure the workforce truly understands what you want from them and give them the ability to let you know when they don't understand. Make sure that if they have a question and they want to share something confidentially, that you teach them and show them how they can do that. And it's not on the slide, but be careful. Do not unintentionally retaliate against employees who have concerns, disagree with how you're moving forward, or whatnot. At the end of the day, if you have an employee who you establish policies, you establish practices, you think you create a safe workplace, and they refuse to come back, that's pretty much that employee resigning from their position, right? It's the same as if you had somebody out on leave and they were injured and they're coming back and they don't want to do what you're asking them to do. Once an employee says, I'm not going to work for you, well, then they've resigned. So, but be cognizant of the fact that you do have rights as an employer as well. So if you can create that safe environment, if you can be clear on what they need to do to come back to the workplace, that will allow you to get them back and build that engagement with them so that you can have a positive experience through this all. Finally, immediate application, right? You leave this call today, you think about it, you digest, you say, hey, that was great information, or hey, I knew all this already, whatever it may be. Hopefully this gets you thinking a little bit about what you need to do. So have that communication strategy and materials. Train your people leaders. I've said it many times today, but train them. Make sure they are just as comfortable, especially new supervisors who are dealing with the challenge of being a supervisor newly anyway, and now they have to deal with this crisis and questions and communications that are very challenging. So mentor your supervisors, train them, pair them up with more experienced supervisors, look at those policies, make quick updates when you can, roll those out. Don't neglect those core values. You got to this point today with your business being successful because you've done the right things. Keep doing the right things. Keep leveraging those key cornerstone items. Your culture, rely on it heavily. Build good communication and engage your people. They've got great ideas and they can help you be successful. And that will help you navigate the crisis. My last thought here is if you really put the employees first and keeping them safe, protecting them, and giving them a way to do the work you need them to do, I think you're going to achieve tremendous success. And I hope all of you get through this healthy and well. And I want to thank you all for joining me today. And I'm going to pass it over to Kate and Jasmine to open it up for questions. But thank you so much for your time. And it was a pleasure speaking to you all.
Thanks, Warren. That was really great. We have had a couple of questions come in. The first is, there is a new hotel opening in North Bergen, and what will they be required by the state of New Jersey to have for guests and employees?
Great question. So the CDC has existing guidance on what to do with your employees. They have specific lists about the PPE that's required. They have specific information around the types of contact you have with employees, the disinfecting of rooms, the disinfecting of spaces that guests are in. So first and foremost, you want to follow almost the same practice that any other business right now has to follow and face, which is how are you cleaning, how are you disinfecting, how are you evaluating the health and wellness of employees, and then how are you going to evaluate the health and wellness of guests that are coming in that could potentially put your employees at risk. So I would look at some of those 4 pillars there of, is the workplace being cleaned to the satisfaction of making sure you're not spreading or risking anything to your employees, not risking or spreading anything to guests, and then how are you mitigating the communication and the training around that, and then look at what steps are going to be needed to make sure you can justify and demonstrate the safety there of both your guests and the employees in the workforce. But beyond that, I'm not familiar with all of the hotel requirements. So I would definitely reach out to find out what the specific requirements around a hotel and having guests stay at a hotel. But for treating it as any other business that I would treat it as, those core things around safe precautions, safe procedures, safe communication, and ways to react when there's a notification is key. Because once you're told that, yes, someone's positive, or once you're told that, yes, there's spread, you want to do everything in your power, to address that, and to make sure that both your your guests, your clients, your customers of that business, and your employees feel it's okay to continue and go on. You don't want to end up where you ignore a complaint or you ignore a suggestion. So I think with that hotel or any others, focus on those core things. What PPP is necessary, what safety precautions, what policies are necessary. Again, protect the workforce and then protect your guests. But I believe there's a lot more detailed information on hotels that are serving the public, obviously, on what their requirements are. And I would definitely go in and look at those, research those specifically, because it's beyond what other businesses or storefronts are required to do.
Great, thank you. Next question. In New Jersey, employees traveling to 16 other states are supposed to quarantine themselves for 14 days upon return. How should a company monitor that?
That is a great question. I probably had that 10 or 15 times in the last week from our clients. So one of the things that you want to think about is the practicality of it, right? If you have an employee who's traveling, the employee could literally tell you, I went to Texas, and so now I have to self-quarantine when I come back, so I'm allowed to take 2 business trips a month because now that I'm back, I have to stay home for 14 days, and now my next trip makes me stay home again. One of the practical strategies we've recommended with some of our clients is that why don't you mandate a policy that after completion of travel, the employer will pay for them or make sure they have time to go get tested. And get tested, and if that test is negative, now you've put yourself in a situation where the quarantine of going back out or doing something is a little different of continuing working versus being home and doing nothing under quarantine. It's also just a good practice from a safety perspective to say, if we as an employer expect you to go somewhere, we're going to do everything we can to give you the time and the resources to get tested upon the completion of that trip to make sure you're safe. So there's not really clear guidance yet, and I don't know if there ever will be, on the topic of quarantining. You know, if you're in New Jersey and you go into Delaware, if you're in Delaware and you go into Jersey, if you're in Philly, all these states are requiring this quarantine to come in there, and yet some people just simply live across the river and have to drive there every day. So how do you handle quarantine? Do you only work 2 days a week, 3 days a week? So I think we have to take a very practical approach of let the employees obtain tests. Let's do what we can to make sure that if they test positive, we give them the resources and tools to get better. And if they're negative, then at that point, they can continue working and continue doing what they need to do. But I would also give the employees the option of communicating to you if they are feeling unsafe or are uncertain about their travel somewhere. So I had one client where if an employee had a channel to management to say, I do not want to travel to this location. Is there any way to do the work remote? Is there any way to do this work in some other way? And you may not always be able to do that, but at least give the employees a way to voice their concerns. In one situation, we actually granted the employees the opportunity to have 1 or 2 weeks of unpaid leave that would allow them to say, all right, well, I'm not going to work for the next 2 weeks, but I may be more comfortable to continue my job in 2 weeks when I feel safer. So there's a lot of avenues you can take, but I don't think there's any clear way to go around this whole quarantine situation, because state by state, they're not aligned and they're not consistent in how they're enforcing this or how they want us to execute it. I really wish I had a clear answer for you, but I think we're all on these calls to talk about how are we practically handling the situation.
Warren, we have a follow-up to that. He was referring to personal travel, not business travel. So if someone goes away for the weekend or goes on vacation to Florida, what is the company, what do they do?
Yeah, so first and foremost, you might not know about it, right? So we may not find out about it. So again, back to your culture, if you have an open environment and open communication, you want your new policy to address that if you have any travel outside of your state, that you need to notify us as your employer so that we can take proper precautions. Now, if the quarantine is the same as lockdown, right? If you say, okay, we currently have this employee historically in the last 2 months set up on virtual remote work, and they decide they're going to go to Florida because Disney's open, and then they come back and they say, I was in Florida, I was at Disney, and now I'm required to quarantine. I would still see if you have the ability as an employer to have them work remotely. I think last resort is them not working, and then all these other benefits of, are they home because of COVID? Are they quarantining? You still have to pay them. So try to find a way through your policies and practices of, can you still have that person working virtually while they get through this quarantine period? At the same time, if they can't, it becomes a situation where they're not able to work, not willing to work, not prepared to work. that's where you kind of go into some solutions where you could maybe offer unpaid leave, or some of these other benefits that have kicked in from this Family Care Act and others may kick in that require you to pay these employees while they're traveling. So I think we're going to have people that are going to try to work the program, work the process, and say, hey, I was in such and such state, now I can't work. But remember, people that don't work don't have to get paid unless they fall under the clear, crisp criteria of the current policies and mandates that are out there. So it's a very tricky scenario, and all these types of questions I'm happy to talk through and work through with you to help you come up with strategies around this, because it will be unique to your workforce, and it will be unique to how your employees are trying to either help you or work you, right? Work the system while they navigate this crisis. And I'm sorry I misunderstood the question at the beginning, but thank you for the follow-up.
Okay, I think that is all the questions. Jasmine, yes, thank you very much. All right, we're gonna go ahead and wrap up a little bit here. Thank you so much, Lauren. That was fantastic. Don't forget, you will all be receiving a recording of today's webinar and the PowerPoint slides via email. Lastly, when you close out of the webinar, a survey will come up on your screen that we hope you'll fill out so we can understand how best to provide you important information in webinar format. Our next webinar, the Nonprofit Fundraising Dilemma, Stop Repeating Failed Strategies, will take place Wednesday, July 15th at 11:30 a.m. So by all means, feel free to register for that at njbia.org/webinars. And don't forget to check out Domain Computer Services for all your IT needs at go-domain.com. Until next time, for Warren Cook of Symbiance Hire, this is Kate Conroy, thanking you for being with us this afternoon and wishing you a great day.